In a separate video, we discussed the anatomy of the thoracic vertebrae. You can't understand the anatomy of the thoracic vertebrae without understanding its relationship to the thorax, or the rib cage. So let's take a look at the rib cage. The function of the rib cage is both protection and movement, and the movement is going to allow for mechanical respiration. So before looking at the anatomy of the rib cage, let's look at both functions that are served by the rib cage, which is protection and movement. So the rib cage is going to protect the heart and the lungs, which are delicate organs that need protection. In addition to protection, the rib cage has to move. Now, if we consider how this movement occurs, well, here we have the thoracic vertebrae in a figure where we can see 3 ribs illustrated that are attached to the sternum. And at the heads of the ribs and at the tubercle, we are going to find movable articulations that are going to permit the ribs to swing upward. And this is illustrated here. The ribs are going to swing upward, kind of like the handle of a pail when it's laying on its side and you pull it up from its side. And in the process of swinging upward, the volume of the thoracic cavity is going to increase. When the volume of the thoracic cavity increases, that's going to cause the pressure within the cavity to decrease, which is going to create a pressure gradient, which is going to draw air from the atmosphere into the lungs. And so this is going to give us mechanical respiration. So keeping in mind that the ribs that are braced against the thoracic vertebrae need to allow for this movement, let's take a closer look at the anatomy of the ribs. So here we have a posterior view of the rib cage, and we're going to zoom in and look at a rib from a posterior perspective. And when we do that and take a close look at the proximal end of the rib, we see there is a wide end, and this wide end is called the head. And on the head, we're going to find the articulations with the bodies of the vertebrae, with the demifacets and the facets. And the reason this wide end is called a head is because of its resemblance to a human head. And human heads have necks, constricted areas where the head is attached to the body. So unless you're heavy into weightlifting, you're going to have a neck. And so we have a neck at the proximal end of the rib. And then we have the tubercle. And the tubercle is going to have an articular part where we find the articulation with the transverse costal facet. It's also going to have a non-articular facet where ligaments and tendons are going to attach. As we move distally along the rib makes a sharp bend, and this bend is referred to as the angle. And along the inferior surface of the rib, there is a groove, and this groove is referred to as the costal groove. Costa is the Latin word for rib, and costal groove simply translates into rib groove. Here is our very nice STL file, 3D file, that we can manipulate. And so we can move the rib cage around and look at it from an inferior view. And from this inferior view, we can get a better appreciation of why the bends in the ribs are referred to as angles. And as we zoom in from this perspective, we're going to be able to look at a rib from an inferior view and get a better look at the costal groove. So here you can see highlighted the costal groove. And in this illustration, it happens to be between the red lines, which indicate the attachments of rib muscles that will be discussed in a separate video. Now, as you look at each rib, starting with rib number 1, you're going to notice that the anatomy of each rib is going to vary somewhat. And the first rib is going to be somewhat unique looking, And so here you can see it isolated. It's much broader, much flatter than the rest of the ribs. But in spite of the variation that we're going to see in the ribs, one characteristic that is shared by the first 7 ribs is that they're all going to attach directly to the sternum. The sternum is also referred to as the breastbone. The word sternum in Latin means breastplate, which is military armor. But if we compare the shape of the sternum to this military object, which is a dagger, we can see it does have a resemblance to a dagger. And the dagger has a handle. And this part of the sternum, which would correspond to where the handle would be, is referred to as the manubrium. And that's what manubrium means. It means basically handle, the place where your hand would hold the dagger. On the manubrium, we're going to find notches that are going to be associated with attachment points for ribs and the clavicle. On the superior edge of the manubrium in the center, we have a suprasternal notch, and the suprasternal tells you that it is on the top of the sternum, supra, above, sternum, suprasternal notch. Flanking the suprasternal notch, we have the notches which are going to be associated with the articulation of the manubrium with the clavicles. And so these notches are referred to as the clavicular notches. At the place where the manubrium attaches to the blade, if you will, which is actually going to be called the body of the sternum, we have an angle which is referred to as the sternal angle. The sternal angle is clinically important because this is a place where the sternum is often fractured, particularly in car crashes when the sternum is thrust against the steering wheel. Below the sternum, the largest portion of the sternum, below the sternal angle, is called simply the body. On the inferior end of the body, there is a slender process, which again resembles a dagger or a sword, if you will. And this process, this slender process, is called the xiphoid process. And it's called the xiphoid process because of its resemblance to a sword. So these names illustrate how the anatomist of the time was naming anatomical structure according to their resemblance to objects that people at the time would have been familiar with. And they would have been familiar with military weapons. As already pointed out, only ribs 1 to 7 attach directly to the sternum. These ribs are referred to as the true ribs. And as you can imagine, the remaining ribs, ribs 8 through 12, are going to be referred to as the false ribs, because they don't attach directly to the sternum. But within this group of false ribs, ribs 11 and 12 are also going to be referred to as the floating ribs. Let's summarize what this figure illustrates. The ribs that are colored red would be the true ribs. The ribs colored green and yellow are the false ribs. And the yellow ribs are the floating ribs. So let's consider why this is so. If we look at this illustration and look more closely at ribs 6 and 7, we can see that they attach directly to the sternum by their costal cartilages. But ribs 8, 9, and 10 do not attach directly by their costal cartilages, and what their costal cartilages do is attach to the cartilage of the rib above. So they do not attach directly to the sternum, but piggyback, in other words, onto the attachment made by the ribs above them. Ribs 11 and 12 are called floating ribs because they do not attach to any other rib either directly or indirectly. So they're, in a sense, just floating. This brings our video to an end. If you'd like to take a quiz, there is a link to a quiz in the description below. Here are the image attributions. And here is the second part of the great plastic tab hunt.